So let's move into our final topic of the day, and that is the immigration issue. I hesitate to call it a crisis in the United States, but that's how it's being presented in the news. Yesterday, Department of Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas was in front of Congress. They were grilling him over the border. We are very happy to be joined by Dr. Ben Becker, editor-in-chief of Breakthrough News, who, by the way, is an expert, dissertation written on immigration. So you can't have a bigger expert than this. Dr. Ben Becker, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me. My dissertation's on immigration history. So if you got any historical questions to throw in also, you can really try to stump me too.
Well,
I
really put
definitely
your
want,
thesis into practice.
if you could tell the story of somehow, some way, Jim Webb's solution to the border crisis in the 80s, we could get to that. Very interesting story. Former senator from Virginia, Secretary of the Navy. But let's get down to business right here. So the whole axis of the discussion yesterday on Capitol Hill, it got very raucous there. Marjorie Taylor Greene was silenced actually by her own party's chairperson of the committee. So it was a very raucous hearing. But the Republicans basically saying that the Democrats have just opened up the border. They're letting anyone in, whoever wants to come at any time. They're letting in fentanyl. It really is like their argument is basically the same as Trump's opening argument to his campaign in 2016, the whole they're not sending their best thing. Democrats, though, are then defending themselves, saying, well, no, we are really tough on the border. So, I mean, are both sides lying? I mean, what's exactly happening here? Because it's hard to discern the truth about, what the policies are of both parties.
They're both lying. I think the Democrats, though, are in a way, by presenting themselves as a tough on immigration party, they are in a way telling more of the truth, which I'd like to remind everyone is basically the exact opposite of the program that they ran on in the 2020 elections, which was that the country was going to have a more humanitarian approach, was going to reverse all of the, widely despised Trump era policies, which were rhetorically extremely aggressive, threatening, racist, xenophobic, nativist towards immigrants and refugees, and they were going to replace it with a much more humane, ordered system that was welcoming to all, that was going to stop deportations even. So I can, report to you after 3 years that basically the rhetoric has changed, but essentially the core Trump era policies have remained. There have been a few changes, but the basic substance of the Trump policies, whether it's Title 42, which allows a public health emergency exemption to do basically mass rejections and expulsions of asylum seekers and migrants. And then Biden himself is actually resurrecting a Trump era policy that those who have entered the country through any place but a port of entry are presumed to be ineligible for asylum, and then there's other policies. There's ones that require migrants who are coming through a third country to ask basically for asylum in like Mexico, that they're ineligible to ask for asylum in the United States unless they've done that first. Basically, these are all the Trump era policies that Biden himself has and his administration has resurrected. Some could say that it's, to appear tough on immigration. It's all political. It's all to prevent themselves from being sort of outflanked by the Republicans in the 2024 elections. I think there's something a little bit deeper going on. It's not just politics. It's actually more reflective of their core program, which is to keep migrants basically in the shadows. And yesterday was an amazing act of political theater. But honestly, when you look at it through history, there's no area of U.S. policy that is more demagogic, that is more subject to such political theater, where there's such a gap between the rhetoric and the reality, where basically the rhetoric on both sides contains within it basically a lie. And so, for instance, the Republican Party, which has a base in big business and corporations and Wall Street forever, while they act tough on immigration and tough at the border and so forth, many of their biggest donors, and not to mention huge industries like agriculture, childcare, construction, the industries that yield them many millions and billions of profits, are also based on undocumented, vulnerable labor at the bottom. So there's this thing that happens in U.S. history where there's all this anti-immigrant panic and wave, and the politics of anti-immigration sit side by side with the political economy of immigration, which is that this country now and has for many decades, in fact, centuries, relied upon immigrant labor.
Yeah, it's important that you mentioned the reason why there's all these policies to keep people in the shadows. But then, of course, since the 90s, we've had this system crop up, this like deportation industrial complex where all of these for-profit companies now make money off of imprisoning undocumented immigrants who are arrested for being undocumented, and then also holding them and then deporting them. There's like an entire for-profit system based around that, on top of all of what you just mentioned, which of course also funds more the Republican Party, but both parties. I'm curious, Ben, wasn't Kamala Harris supposed to be like a czar for immigration, and she was supposed to go to Central America? I'm not really sure. She gave some speech, I think, at one point in Guatemala. First, I guess my first question here is, what happened to Kamala Harris and her capacity to deal with immigration? Has she succeeded? And then second of all, more importantly, all jokes aside, I think that another angle that's left off of this entire conversation is the policies that are creating these migration waves in the first place, which is like the imperialist aspect of this. Can you talk about those two things? First, Kamala Harris, and then also the actual policies that have not changed under either Republicans or Democrats that remain the same in actually pushing people to want to come to the United States in the first place?
It seems to me Kamala Harris has basically only gotten the assignments of the things that they know are going to fail, and
Right.
basically the sort of dirty work, so to speak. Because honestly, her trip to Central America, again, there's an element of it that's totally farcical, and that of course, she did not succeed. There was no solution, but in a way, there could be no solution within the boundaries of this capitalist and imperialist system, as you said. Because why? Central America is a region that has, suffered decades of political violence, social crisis, a drug crisis, an unemployment crisis that's been ravaged by neoliberal policies, that's had its agricultural sectors wiped out. I mean, you name it, Central America has been really caught in the whirlwind of a whole vector of imperialist policies. So it's no accident or surprise that large numbers of people are seeking a way out, just like generations of people have from Europe and from other parts of the world, all throughout history. When people find their own countries unlivable, they are not usually going to just stay there. They're going to find some exit. And people are using asylum, but honestly, the economics are the core issue in all of this. It's not just political violence, although that's part of it. And the United States, I don't know if people have ever looked at a map, but it has a 2,000-mile long border with Mexico, which is the largest land border in the world between basically global north and global south. This fact cannot change regardless of which government is in power. So therefore, people who are coming, people are going to come to the north if they believe that there's more economic opportunity. And when you think about the whole history of how the United States became a rich, powerful, quote unquote, prosperous country, despite the fact that half of the country is in or near poverty, you have to look at how that value ended up here. So in a way, you can think about these groups of people basically chasing the stolen and exploited value from their countries back to where it resides, which is in the United States. And they come here and they generally work very low wage jobs. They are not criminals and by any larger number than any other sector of the population, and yet they're demonized as such. They're spat on, they're disenfranchised, they have fewer labor rights, they're basically barred from accessing any public benefits whatsoever, with the exception of their children going to public schools, but the right wing is even going after that. I mean, it's really incredible what these folks are made to endure. And when you look at the media, it's just like it comes out of nowhere. It's just based on them or their illegality or the poverty of their countries, and there's no context given to the push factors that have been presented, that present themselves in their countries, and the pull factors. And there are, in fact, pull factors in the United States that are pulling migrants and immigrants here. So, Kamala Harris, what was she supposed to do in a way? I mean, the real answer to these things would basically be to have a Central America that has much higher rates of economic development, that is free from imperialist exploitation. Basically, there would have to be revolutions based on social justice in those countries that gave people the sense that they have a future in those countries. And if anything, the United States has done everything to prevent those kinds of revolutions. And then when revolutions do take place, like in Venezuela and Cuba, they're basically isolated from the global economy. So, of course, people are going to migrate to find better jobs, even from those countries that have had revolutions. In a way, you can think of them as being forcibly pushed out of the global economy through sanctions and blockades. And by them crossing the border, they're trying to rejoin that global economy. So I think a lot of politicians, sort of play on people's fears, on people's anxieties. And honestly, of course, people do have real anxieties and fears that can be played upon. And that's why it's such a successful political strategy, even if there's no underlying, actual successful strategy to deal with this issue head on.
Yeah, no, very, very well taken point. And even just today or yesterday, rather, at the same time, more sanctions put on Nicaragua, which is, one of the more successful countries in Central America economically, but they're trying to stop that. And then they say, oh, look at all these Nicaraguans coming here. But, it's an interesting factor. And I think the politics of immigration in many ways is only looked at, Ben, from the side of the right wing and the demagogues and the racists. But, one of the things that's most interesting to me when you look at the 2020 Democratic primary is the county by county breakdown of where Bernie Sanders won. And it's honestly deeply illuminating to me because, of course, the stereotypical Sanders supporter, the so-called Bernie bro, that's what's in the mainstream media. But if you look at where he's actually winning elections, it's almost every county on the border in Texas. It's the heavily Latino working class areas of New Mexico and Arizona. It's Clark County in Las Vegas. And I feel pretty sure that was also Latino workers, not like random, libertarians in gun shops just outside Vegas. East LA, he won going away. So, the areas that are Latino working class folks, I'm sure many of them younger based on what we know about Sanders politics. Also, kind of parenthetically, every Native American reservation in America. But it just feels like that. Thinking, tying this to the immigrant rights movement of the 2006-2007, the movement of the Dreamers that was so powerful for so many people during the early Obama administration, that the flip side of what has been happening here is that Latino working class people, especially young people, the children of those who migrated to this country, often born in this country, but sometimes, coming here at very young ages, have also become a significant vanguard of what is an obvious and clearly representative shift politically, at least among some subset of the population, as significant to the left, even though, that is often, hidden in the mainstream media.
And if you think about it, those are the young people who grew up in the disappointment of the Obama years. That Obama came in promising a path to legalization for their families, for their parents, and instead became known as the deporter-in-chief. So when Hillary Clinton came along, and who was the Secretary of State under Obama, who herself had managed and administered a lot of these policies, that community, even though she courted it quite heavily in very sort of pandering ways, the Latino community, I think especially among young people, but then even more broadly, saw something in Bernie Sanders that was very different from the Democratic establishment. And I think it's going to be very hard for the Democratic establishment to win back those communities without actually passing a reform. Unfortunately, I think it's very unlikely that a legalization bill is going to pass at any time in the coming years. It did not pass again under the last 2 years when the Democrats had the majority in the House and the Senate and the White House, similar to Obama's initial years. So now we're entering a new wave of demoralization and disappointment with the Democratic Party establishment. And where can people turn? Of course, they're not going to turn to the right. The people who are, some will in small numbers, but in general, that's not going to happen. So people are looking, I think, increasingly for a left-wing outlet. And historically, this is the role of the left and of the working class more generally, especially the labor unions. Historically in the country, the labor unions were part of the anti-immigrant movement for many, many decades. But there was a big turn in the 1980s in particular, which made a different argument, which is that, look, we're not going to raise wages and raise conditions for workers in this country by keeping people out. The country is too big. There's too many push and pull factors. People are going to come into the country. So what's the answer? We can't allow basically the capitalists or the employers to divide the native born versus the foreign born. We basically have to give everyone equal rights, bring them all into the same labor unions, covered under the same contracts, raise the floor for everyone is the only answer to that kind of divide and conquer strategy. And so when the labor unions started to make this change in their position in the 80s and in the 90s, I think it was a very important development. And I think it sort of sets the stage for this kind of unity between Latino communities, Asian communities, Black and white communities. There has to be a basis for people to come together. And it's got to be on the basis of fighting for common workers' interests. And so, again, I think that's basically the core program of the left. And, you know, that is happening, but it's not really being registered in mainstream politics. And when you think about it, there's still 12, 13 million people who are disenfranchised politically. Imagine if those 12 and 13 million people got voting rights, were able to participate in the political system. It would shift the correlation of forces in a big way. And I think, of course, the Republicans are very alarmed by that possibility. It means they might not ever win another federal election. But I think even the Democratic Party has some concern that this could shift politics to the left in the country. And they, as a party of Wall Street, don't want that either.
No, I think that's a very good point.
Yeah, which is why it's like, I think that we're going to see the demagoguery from Republicans continue to go up, especially as we near another presidential election. It seems like they're just kind of setting the groundwork for making the border a major issue, talking about the lawlessness at the border, playing up what they've done before, playing up like any crime that's been committed anywhere by somebody who happened to be, you know, an immigrant or an undocumented immigrant. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, these are the time-tested, age-old tactics of scapegoating, of divide and conquer. You know, the political class studies history. They know they don't actually have a solution to a lot of the big social and economic problems. They don't really want to talk about the billions of dollars that are being spent on war. They don't want to really talk about the gutting of the public health system or the education system or inflation. But if you can get people talking about undocumented immigrants committing crimes by cherry picking a few things, or you cherry pick a few sensational stories related to CRT or to trans rights or trans young people, you know, if you can always sort of be waving some shiny new thing that can distract and divide people, it's actually quite effective. And the Republican Party hope that they can make the 2024 election a referendum on these issues where they believe they still have a majority, rather than on the core social and economic issues. And so I think it's, you know, important we have to rally to the defense of anyone who's being attacked and demonized and scapegoated. But we also have to point this whole thing out, that this is really a calculated political trick that's being played on the tens of millions of people in this country.
No, I think it certainly is. And the theater, as you say, is only going to escalate. Apparently, they're going to try to impeach the DHS head Mayorkas, which means they're just going to go even wilder. But anyway, we will continue to cover all of this as closely as we can here on Breakthrough News. Good thing our editor-in-chief is an expert. Dr. Ben Becker, as always, it's a pleasure to have you here with us on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me.